and today we have 170 modules in like the Uber app. Right, and this is not counting any of the other external, like other libraries that we do for networking and other stuff like that. This is just the new Uber app. So that itself.
From the Spec Network, this is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm DonnFelker.
And I'm KaushikGopal.
Welcome to the show.
In today's episode, we're going to continue on the discussion, but this time we're going to dive in deep into OkBuck and everything about the Buck build system. We hope you enjoy.
Now, the big question that I have here is, as an Android developer, I'm very familiar with Gradle as a build system. And so I kind of am apprehensive to leave for something brand new. I mean, it's probably a larger learning curve, etc. And it looks like, from what I can tell, is you guys have created basically a Gradle plugin for Buck called OkBuck. Can you talk a little bit about what OkBuck is and maybe why I would want to use it just compared to regular Buck?
It's a great question. So, as you said, right, you really don't want to learn a new build system. We were in the same exact boat as you were, because especially change is hard, especially when you have like hundreds of developers working on this code base, right?
Oh, yeah.
They're all familiar with Gradle. At that point, what we wanted to look at is, hey, is there any way we can kind of like use the existing structure and still use Buck without like forcing a large migration on all our developers, all the cognitive overhead and like tooling stuff, the CI related things. It was just a nightmare to do all that in like a small amount of time. So what we did was we started looking at this project, open source project called OkBuck. This is not something that we owned before. It was by a guy in Beijing called Piasi Su. He wrote this project as a hobby project actually, and it was building very basic Android projects at that point of time when we discovered it. So at that point of time, when we tried it on our code base, a lot of things were not flexible enough for it to actually consider it production ready. So we kind of like went in, rewrote it from scratch almost over a period of like 3 to 4 months, and brought it to a state where it's very high quality and could be considered production ready. And that's kind of like why we use it at this point, because we have a lot of different tools that we use. We pretty much use everything under the sun that Google puts out, from like custom linting to like Gradle transform APIs. All of that stuff needs to work in like the alternate build system. And sometimes there's no analog, right? So there's no actual thing called a lint rule in Buck if you actually go through it docs. So we had to bridge the gap, and that's kind of like where OkBuck comes in.
So just to step back a little, like, because like right now it's a little confusing for me, because you're saying Buck is a Gradle plugin. So, but fundamentally, Gradle and Buck are like on opposite sides, right? So, like, how does that work? Like, why do you use Gradle to bridge in like Buck, or like help me in sort of like, because right now my mind is like split in two parts, right? Like, there's Gradle and there's Buck, and now like, wait, both of these are working together? Like, I don't understand, right? Like,
what?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So, easy way to understand this would be, let's say that you have a project that's currently being built with Gradle, and you want to try out this new system just because you're curious, let's say, right?
Exactly. That's what I want.
But you don't want to spend all the time, right? All the time and all the effort to like migrate. And what's the simplest thing you want to look for is like, hey, is there anything that can make the transition automatic for me? That's kind of like how, if you think about it, it's basically a project converter. It's a build system converter. And the way OkBuck is currently written, it's very easy to actually convert the Gradle project into any other build system. So if you look at Maven back in the day, Android Studio used to come with something called a Maven to Gradle Converter, which kind of did very similar things.
Oh boy, yeah, I remember those days.
Yeah, so it's kind of similar to that, but since there's actually a huge gap in kind of like the concept between the two build systems, there is a level of complexity that needs to be bridged, so the developers don't need to spend time understanding, hey, like how does this exactly work, right? So to make that even easier, we have something called a Buck wrapper that the OkBuck plugin sets up for you, very similar to the Gradle wrapper. Right? So we kind of just stole that name.
This is like Buck W, right?
Exactly. So we just call it Buck W. So if you want to build an APK, you say Buck W build APK. If you want to test something, you say Buck W test this module. Or if you want to lint something, you say Buck build lint something. So that's kind of like bridges that gap and like takes the the overhead of like understanding the system away. So that's why I think the OkBuck is very quick way for you to try out and see if Buck is right for your project and what it can bring, what value it can bring to your project or your code base.
Cool. So basically, if you've almost sold me, and I'm like, okay, I want to try Buck. So what would my first steps be? Look at OkBuck and then like try to add that in, or like other instructions on OkBuck? Like where do we? Yeah.
How do we get started?
Sure. That's a great question. So OkBuck has a sample project with a lot of different examples. So there is also a very extensive wiki and guide for like migration. 90% of the time, you just apply the plugin, and if it doesn't complain, it should just work, right?
Okay.
So there are particular cases, especially in like a large enterprise level build, that you may want to customize, or you may have had a bunch of legacy Gradle hackiness somewhere in your build that you want to like see that, hey, this doesn't work with Buck. So for example, another company that uses OkBuck very extensively right now is Airbnb. So once we open sourced it, those guys were pretty interested. They wanted to try it out, kind of the same problem, right? So a lot of these companies that are hitting this issue are everyone who started with Gradle but are reaching this point of scale where Gradle is not just working out for them, and they want alternatives, but they don't have the bandwidth or the time to like go just research something new. So that's kind of like where this kind of solution fits in, and they basically did the entire thing in like maybe three days to a week, right? 2 engineers just sit down, understand like what the system looks like, and kind of like go try it out, right?
So I guess like our first step is to go and look at the README, and then there are like examples and instructions, and I think like that's the good starting point for us. So we would sort of understand where to move from there.
Yep. They also gave a talk at Droidcon NYC in September. We'll probably link to that talk as well.
Absolutely.
Because that actually covers really well like what the migration path looks like, and kind of like the gotchas that users might encounter and what to watch out for.
Oh, fantastic. Even better. We'll definitely add a link to that in our show notes.
So you said that OkBuck is something that you folks are using, Airbnb and using. Is this something that is production ready, or is this something you guys are just testing out still? Because to me, and from what I can tell, Kaushik, it's very interesting. I kind of want to go play with it. If I'm able to convince clients that, hey, this is going to add or cut down your build time significantly, which is going to increase your developer productivity, like that affects the bottom line. So the real root question here is this something that I can go use today?
Sure. To answer that question, we have been using it to build the new Android app that you guys are using right now. For the first time it released, all the way back since we were developing on it 6 months ago, right?
Oh, wow.
And at this point, all of Uber uses Buck to build for Android as well as iOS, but like it uses OkBuck on a daily basis. It goes through a lot of churn, and we make sure that any new features that people request, for example, we added support for things like SQL Delight or like from Square or like Retro Lambda or the Gradle Transform plugin or anything else that are like very custom. It actually supports a lot of those use cases out of the box at this point. So it's very comes with batteries kind of situation where you can try it out, and if nothing's actually working or something's actually broken, it's very easy for us to like go add that support, because the way it's written is super easy to extend, and we got a lot of external contributions to Buck and OkBuck to actually make it easy for us to consume these changes as well.
Oh, that's a good question. Is OkBuck open source?
Yes, it's completely open source. You can go check out github.com/uber/OkBuck, and all the code is right there.
It looks like you guys are MIT licensed too, for the folks that are wondering.
Excellent. That's a good license to have, I hear.
Exactly.
Yeah, also like in terms of the quality of the product itself, I think Airbnb is not the only one using it. There's Stilt, who's been using it for a while. The guys at Square are evaluating it currently. And we also have a Buck Slack setup, which we'll probably link to, where a bunch of companies are like usually chatting about like different developments, how it's being used, and what are like their unique situations that they're facing, right? So that's also something that's open to people to join if they're interested to like learn more about it.
Now, I mean, we're all software engineers, so we understand that not everything in the land of software engineering and Android development is sunshine and rainbows, right? So right now, it's like hearing the advantages from Buck, it is sounding like pretty much like sunshine and rainbows. But I think it's also fair to like see like there's got to be like some disadvantages like with Buck, right? For example, one thing that I've heard is there are external dependencies is not necessarily something that is supported out of the box, right? Is this still true? Or because I remember the early days when Buck was being thrown around, when people were like super frustrated with Gradle, right? That was one thing that was brought about.
So it's still not supported in the broad sense, because with Gradle you have a lot of fine-tuning ability where you can say, hey, I want this dependency, but not the transitive dependencies that brings in. There's no concept of Maven exactly in Buck yet. So so if you had to understand that Buck was built for like a monorepo situation that Facebook is currently in, which means that the whole code base has all sorts of jars and external dependencies checked in, which may not work for everyone, which is why OkBuck bridges that gap as well. It uses Gradle's dependency resolution, so you basically get the exact same dependencies as you would get in Gradle, and it downloads them to a local cache that Buck can actually then reuse to build the code base, right? So if you just use it with Buck today, it still does not do external dependencies. There is a very basic support called Buck fetch that can fetch a file using curl, but there is no like dependency management in terms of the Maven sense, right? So it's definitely useful for people who are coming from the Maven world to kind of use OkBuck to bridge that gap.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So essentially, like I guess then the disadvantage, if you can call it that, is that all those would be like pulled locally versus like having like references directly to those being hosted.
Having it locally can bloat up your repository if you're not using things like Git LFS, for example, right? And these kind of things are like not super well documented on the Buck website. They say, hey, you can have this jar checked in, and like you can like pretty much go with it. And the truth of the matter of fact is like Facebook has like tailored their VCS solution to like scale really well. Like they use Mercurial, and they have a lot of custom things in-house to kind of like make it very easy to work with large scale code bases. That's not something that's in everyone's reach. So this kind of like says, if you don't have monorepo, it's still okay to use it on small scale projects, but eventually as your project grows, your build will grow with you and not slow you down. So a really good example I can tell you about is our code base has grown from 40 modules from the get-go, I think maybe 3 months ago. And today we have 170 modules in like the new Uber app. Right? And this is not counting any of the other external, like other libraries that we do for networking and other stuff like that. This is just the new Uber app. So that is itself. And then we haven't actually changed in terms of the build speed. It's exactly the same. And we also have something called a network cache, which I forgot to mention. So Buck comes with something called a remote build cache, which means that if you build something on CI, for example, it's cached on the network cache. So let's say if CI has built master, I come in tomorrow, I say, okay, git rebase, I got the latest master, I type Buck build, and it says build done 3 seconds. So what just happened there? Downloaded the exact APK for that SHA from the network cache, and it says, okay, you don't really need to build anything because it's already been built on a different machine. You can just go use it.
Oh,
that's magic.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So like it's basically like shared sort of build caches, right? For
exactly. And you can do that because builds are reproducible. You couldn't do that if builds are not reproducible or not equivalent on different machines.
This makes sense. So it's like coming full circle in terms of like the reproducibility aspect.
So currently our build times are like if you're a like fresh clone of the repo, 12 seconds on Wi-Fi, 3 seconds on Ethernet.
That's pretty cool. Man. That's nice to hear. It's just like so.
And we also open sourced like the network cache implementation because the Facebook cache didn't implement one; they would just have an API. Mm-hmm. But Uber also open sourced our Buck HTTP cache implementation that's linked to in the README of OkBuck if you're interested to try it out. I think Airbnb folks already use it right now for their builds as well.
Kudos to you folks.
Yeah, good job, Uber.
Thank you.
I guess there are 2 points. One is, this is a network cache. So like the hope is if you're in a company and you have Ethernet, then like it would depend on the internet. Because if your network connection is slow, well, then don't expect to see like 3 seconds, right?
Yeah, it's maybe 30 seconds then. Because you also have a local cache on your machine, right? So there's multiple levels of cache.
Right. You mentioned about the documentation, and that is also something that I guess like we should let our listeners know. So the documentation at this point is not necessarily up to snuff, right?
Yeah. So we found that a lot when we were contributing to Buck because, for example, there were things inside the Buck code base that are not immediately obvious or things that are not on the public documentation. Mm-hmm. This is not something problematic generally because you can have look at the source code, and you typically get a good understanding of what's going on once you dig in.
Mhm.
But it was definitely a surprise initially when we were starting to adopting Buck.
When I took a before we hopped on this on the call here and for the podcast, I did take a look over the last couple of days at the Buck website, and I started hopping into the docs thinking, you know what, I'm going to see if I can try this out. And what I immediately felt was this kind of like apprehension to learn it, not because I didn't want to learn something new. I love learning, but it was kind of this big thing of like when you first learn something like Dagger or dependency injection, it's like it's like this very large, steep learning curve that kind of turned me away. Have you found that to be the case with Buck as well? Is there a very large learning curve to this, or a steep learning curve?
For some parts of it, yes. So if you're doing like a very basic build, like most of the systems, like the examples that they have on their websites are very, very basic, right? So they won't list, for example, how do you hook up annotation processors, or how do you do like build flavors or variants and things like those, right? So when you look at that example, you'll say, hey, this looks nice, but reality is a lot of developers use these features today. So it may not
for
be
sure.
very easy to access that information. So there is definitely, I would not say a steep learning curve, but a more longer one, right? So it'll take you longer to like kind of find the right information. And OkBuck is kind of like where it says, okay, it's just too much information. Let's try to like bring it all together, give them like a nice API or interface to like just go build their thing and get out of the way, right? So that's kind of like why we really like OkBuck.
Gotcha. That makes sense. The other question I had with respect to like Buck, because like I'm very enthused to try it out, but one of the biggest advantages with Gradle, like especially it was like one of like the advertised features is the concept of like product flavors, build variants. Does Buck support the same thing? Because that's like actually a pretty useful feature, right, for many folks.
Totally. So Buck has no concept of build variants as such, but OkBuck does support that. So we do the translation logic in such a way that it doesn't really make a big difference. So let's say with Gradle, you do something like, hey, assemble flavor 1 debug. So with Buck, you would say Buck build flavor 1 debug instead. So we kind of did that translation because Buck doesn't really have a concept of build flavors or variants, but you can kind of like map what Gradle does today and say, hey, so when you build flavor 1 flavor 1 debug and flavor 2 debug, you're pretty much recompiling twice, right? So all the source code is just compiled twice, and they're treated as two separate targets. So we kind of like do the mapping that way.
Okay, so actually that's where OkBuck comes into play. It sort of like does that. It sort of like works as a wrapper.
If you do that manually, it can take quite a time. I think some of the largest build files we have are around like 5 to 10,000 lines of code of Buck files, especially.
Whoa.
Yeah. For like really complex builds, right?
Right. No, yeah, I imagine, because like you said, time, but like even beyond time, I would imagine complexity is like the tricky thing, right? Because like, and these are things, especially if you're building multiple variants here, you want to be careful about those, right?
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, in terms of other features, I think it does support at least OkBuck, the way it does mapping, it supports unit tests, espresso tests, like Gradle transforms have been added recently.
Oh, really?
Something that we're kind of like working on right now is Kotlin support, because the community is like moving towards it very heavily. And Kotlin build times are not exactly where they're supposed to be, as far as from developers' feedback that I've been hearing in the community. So that's definitely very important to us. We do have some tooling internally in Kotlin. We don't have it in production yet, but we want to basically have a way to build it at scale. So we're definitely looking at that in the next few weeks or so.
Now, you did say that it does support testing, so like Android tests and unit tests. Do you know if perhaps the unit tests are faster? I would have a hard time believing that the Android tests would run faster, because we're literally waiting on probably espresso and idling resource and stuff like that. But what about the unit tests themselves?
Sure. So unit tests are faster purely because it can run multiple targets in like a very interesting way. So it runs all of these like multiple threads, different targets. So when you take away the overhead of configuration and take away the overhead that, hey, if I run a test target, right, and if everything's up to date, and let's say I change one single file somewhere in my code base, and since it knows kind of like how that bubbles up, it'll say only these particular test cases have to be rerun. So it'll just run that subset of test targets, which makes it very fast to iterate.
Okay, cool, excellent.
I had one question about like the Kotlin support, because I'm sure this is something our listeners would want to ask. you mentioned that you're trying to like add Kotlin support, right? Right now, Kotlin build times are supposed to be like significantly longer than what people would ideally want, right? Would Buck be able to solve that problem in some way? Like, where does like, or is it like something that's inherently a problem with like when you generate Java classes from like Kotlin?
Sure. So I can talk a little bit about that. So I forgot to mention one important detail, which is Buck does something called ABI checking. So an ABI is an application binary interface. So let's say you have two classes A and B in two different modules, and B depends on A. And when let's say you change A today in Gradle, it says, hey, A is changed, B has to rebuild itself. But what Buck does is if you change like a private method that does not really affect anything in B, it will not rebuild B. It will just rebuild A, and it will pack the DEX files together directly inside the APK. So when you go with Kotlin, kind of like the same principle applies. So for every jar that comes out of a module, it'll create this like an ABI jar, which kind of like has all the public APIs. So especially if you're like iterating on something really quick or you're changing methods, kind of similar to Instant Run, it's like Instant Run on the command line where it can skip a significant portion of the build.
Oh, that's pretty cool. And how does that play into like the Kotlin support? Like it would apply the same logic to Kotlin?
Yep, because all of these targets are actually generating jar files at the end of the day. So it doesn't really care how the jar file is materialized. It could be Kotlin, Scala, Groovy, Java. Doesn't really matter. Right?
So the benefits of like the incremental compilation, like because of the way it's approached, like you sort of like get those benefits across like
Exactly.
using it in other languages. Oh, that's pretty slick. Okay, so like all this is amazing, right? So like what's the future for OkBuck? Like what's the like on the roadmap? You mentioned Kotlin support. That's pretty cool. Are there any other things that you wanted to tell us about, like to get us even more excited?
Sure. So I think once you have, at this stage, we have so many modules that the slowest part of our build is the time we take to actually run OkBuck. So
that's funny.
It's pretty funny.
Yeah, that's pretty funny. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's still based in Gradle. So I just merged some changes today that basically makes it run a bunch of these things in parallel. We're looking at incremental task execution. The way it was written initially was more like, hey, let's try to get this working. Because our builds were dying, we need to like make sure that we can build.
And your developers in the process, 20 minutes, man. That's
exactly. It's just insane. Like the wins we had was just insane. So at this point, we're more doing polish where we have incremental builds to promote. It's still some APIs not finalized. We're trying to get like stable APIs, and we want to have feature parity at the end of the day with whatever the Android Gradle plugin has. At this point, it's about 90%, I would say, but there are some features still not supported, like the transform thing was very recent. I don't imagine many people would use that, but something that we use. So we're kind of like slowly trickling down all the features that people are requesting and trying to like make sure it's airtight pretty much, right? So at this point, Kotlin is the next big thing for us, and also like making OkBuck faster and scalable in the long run, because people might be tempted to just switch all the way to Buck, but then you might lose access to like the Gradle plugins that the community puts out. Like Square might come out with like a great Gradle plugin tomorrow and like, oh man, I wish I was still using Gradle to use that.
True.
For sure. Yeah. All right. This
fantastic.
I know this is a lot to digest. I'm super amped up now. But for folks who are listening, like, what are some good resources that you can tell us? Like, because I want to try this tomorrow. Like, as I get in, I want to try this. What are some resources that you think I should be looking at, and like, how do I get started?
Sure. If you want to just admire how fast it is, I would say there is a test project that we put up a while back to test Android Studio and Gradle. This funny thing, this project is today used by the tools team and the Gradle guys to regression test their performance on every release. So it's a very bulky project.
Okay, and it's a pretty legit thing. It's not like some like convoluted project that like shows how like Buck is doing better.
Yeah, it's basically our project, but we removed all the code and obfuscated all the project names pretty much.
I see. Okay. Oh, that's pretty cool.
So it is something that Uber basically has as a mirror pretty much, right? So it's kind of like a pro-guarded Uber project that has like no actual information in there, just dependencies. So that kind of gives you an idea of how fast it is. Okay. And there's also like the OkBuck GitHub page where you have the actual project in the README. There's also the Droidcon NYC talk. The video is also up on YouTube that we can link to. And there is a Buck Slack that Facebook maintains that people can hop in, can get like understanding of like what's going on currently, what are people using, what issues they're facing, so forth.
Fantastic.
And I want to mention something really quick before we wind down. There is a support for generating Bazel rules from OkBuck now, because the Bazel team in New York said, hey, this is a great project. Let's just try adding Bazel support. So they actually did. There's a PR still up right now that I haven't merged yet. But OkBuck will ship, the next version will probably have a way to generate Bazel. So you can kind of like compare all three systems side by side if you wanted to.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Wow.
That would be very interesting. All right, Gautam, thank you so much. Yeah, I can't wait. Like, I can't wait to hop off this call and like start like exploring OkBuck more.
Yeah, like I have like shiny object syndrome times 5.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should definitely try it out. I think it's definitely something that's low investment to just like, hey, just apply the plugin, see if it works out, and there is no upfront cost you're paying to do the migration. So it's definitely
That's
something
so
to look
nice.
at.
Thank you so much for like spending your time and like sharing your wisdom on like OkBuck. I think this is like going to be great. Our listeners are also definitely going to appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, guys.
And if our listeners want to reach out to you, like what's an easy way to do that?
I am on Twitter at KageIIT, KAGEIIT. Not super active, but I do monitor it from time to time. So that might be a good way to reach out to me.
All right, that makes sense. And Don, if folks want to reach out to you after your experiences with having tried Buck?
The best way again is Twitter, and that's going to be at DonnFelker. But the real question is, how do they get a hold of you, Kaushik?
I am Kaushik Gopal on Twitter, and yeah, if you give me some time, I will also try Buck, and that's a good place for folks to reach out to me. Alrighty, thank you so much for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this show. I know Don and I have definitely enjoyed the show. We will catch you in the next episode.
Yeah, and if you want to add more fuel to the fire, just know that we do fully incremental builds everywhere on CI and local all the time.
Wow.
We never clean.
Wow, really?
Wow.
So that's like...
Yeah, never clean it. We trust the system so much.
Because right now, my de facto is to like, I don't do incremental, like I don't even do instant run. I don't do incremental builds like today at Instacart.
Me either.
Because I don't trust it. It worked pretty well, but like I got burnt once and that was enough for me. And I was like, hell no. Because I wasted 2 hours like just like trying to figure out what happened. And I realized like a class was hot swapped incorrectly, right?
It's a mystery.
That drove me up the wall.
Not again. Never. 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 Never.